One of the things I've really learned more explicitly, I would say in the last 6 months, is to not win. I knew this already. Like in my clinical practice, I tried my best not to be right. So for example, as a clinician, you can dispense advice, and so it'd be quite easy, especially if I wasn't suffering at that time while practicing as a clinician, and the person was, I think, well, I've got my life together pretty well, and I'll just tell you what you should do. And sometimes people would ask for that, right? But it's not that helpful because, well, what the hell do you know about what they should do? You can introduce topics of conversation like, well, most people have friends and you don't seem to have any, and maybe you have a reason for that, and maybe it's a fundamentally valid reason, and that's not where your interests are oriented. Maybe you're particularly introverted, which doesn't mean you don't need friends. But that's way different than saying, well, here's what you should do. And the problem with here's what you should do is, first of all, as the psychoanalyst knew, you just set up resistances in people. And the reason, so they won't do it, even if they want your advice, and often they'll do the opposite, just out of spite, and probably they should, because they're basically saying, up yours. It's like, this is my life, man, not yours. And the other problem with advice is, well, let's say you take my advice and then you go do something good. It's like, well, whose victory is that? Is it yours or mine? So did I just steal your victory? Well, that's not so good. And so I learned that pretty thoroughly as a clinician, not to do that, and hopefully as a husband and father, also not to do that. But in my talks with people like Sam Harris, I was more instrumental than I should have been. There were points I was trying to make, and I was trying to be right. And there's times for that, and there's partisan situations where only one side can win and another side has to lose. An election is like that. But I've really learned, I hope, that in the last 6 or 7 months to not do that, And so the last conversation I had with Sam Harris, which was 2 weeks ago, which will be released in a relatively short order, was by far the best conversation we ever had. And all I did was ask him questions. And that wasn't manipulative. It wasn't like, well, I'm going to, and no one here in the audience has done this yet, but lots of times people ask me questions. They're not questions. They're disguised criticisms, or they're statements of belief, or they're an observation that perhaps if my Christian beliefs, for example, were more fully differentiated, I accepted Christ as my Savior, that would be a good thing. That comes up quite often. And they're not questions. Like a question is something you want the answer to. Like actually, you want to know what the person thinks. And so all I did was ask Harris questions. And I learned all sorts of things about the way he thought that I didn't know, and about commonalities in our approach to problems that I didn't understand. And the conversation was much more enjoyable. I mean, the give and take of our previously more tendentious conversations had, what would you say? There was an element of sort of combative enjoyment to them. So they weren't nothing, and they were reasonably successful as public spectacles, and I suppose as philosophical investigations, but this was way better. And I understood what motivated Sam way more than I did before.